We gave IKEA $15 million to come into the city of Memphis. While at the same time, somebody who had owned a furniture store in the city for 25 years did not get a dime and was eventually put out of business by this place. So look, we want free markets and we want to give everyone a chance to compete.
I'm Alex Wardlaw.
And I'm Stephanie Slish.
Welcome to Unrig the System. We're organizers of Unrig Summit, the nation's biggest democracy reform event of the year.
In March of 2019, Unrig Summit brought together over 2,000 people from all 50 states to Nashville, Tennessee, to celebrate 2018's historic victories for the democracy reform movement and to build a better future for America.
On this podcast, we'll bring you conversations from the summit featuring the brightest minds from the right and the left on how to solve America's political crisis.
If you're fed up with political business as usual and want to learn about cutting-edge reforms to take back our democracy, then this is the podcast for you.
Corruption in the political system inevitably works its way into the marketplace. In today's episode, thought leaders and business practitioners explain why unrigging the political system is key to a more free and fair economy.
Moderated by John Sarasulo, CEO of ADS Security and board chair of the Beacon Center of Tennessee, this conversation highlights the stories of leaders who have fought back against special interests in the marketplace.
John kicks off the conversation. Let's take a listen.
It is a thrill to have a chance to sit up here on stage with this group. You're going to love the stories that you hear today. It's been fun for me to read up on their backgrounds, learn a little bit about them, and get a chance to chat with them a little bit before we started here today. And I'm convinced you're going to be as compelled by their stories as I've been. I'm going to do a quick intro just to kind of kick things off. So we start with Jeff Clemens, just to my right here. Jeff is the president of American Promise, an organization I'm sure you'll hear a little bit about. He is an attorney, an author, and has been published in a host of national media, and also the founder of Whaleback Partners, which invests in entrepreneurial businesses building a sustainable local food economy, and has previously served in Massachusetts as an assistant attorney general. So great background and going to add some real interesting color to the conversations today. Thanks, Jeff. Next is Deborah Newtall-Williams. I know Deborah really well, even though we just met today. I know a lot about her and her story, and she's a hero of mine because what you're going to hear about what she went through to stand up to a real bully state government that tried to stop her from her version of the American dream, and we're really honored to have her with us. She's a natural hair stylist, founder of the first braiding salon in the state of Tennessee. She's a pioneer in the natural hair care industry and has just an absolutely compelling story that we're going to have the chance to hear about. Deborah, thank you for joining us. Mark Cunningham serves as the Vice President of Communications at the Beacon Center, oversees communications and outreach for the Beacon Center, and leads the organization's marketing efforts to educate the public on issues. He's going to talk a lot about corporate welfare, but issues generally related to free markets and restrictions on the state from interfering in the lives of Tennesseans. And then finally, someone who I'm absolutely thrilled to get a chance to meet because I read a lot about her over the last couple of days. Jana Flisrand, who came all the way from Minnesota to join us. She gets the award for traveling the farthest. And she has an absolutely phenomenal story about something recently that happened in Minneapolis that you're going to get to hear a lot about. And it's a great story. She's been a pro-homes advocate for years. She co-founded a group called Neighbors for More Neighbors. And that was a group that led this grassroots effort to change zoning laws in Minneapolis to support a more effective housing market. So really happy, Jana, to have you here with us. Thank you for joining us. So I'd like to start by asking each of the panelists to share a little bit about their personal experience with anti-competitive behavior. And Jana, if we can, we'll start with you. I'd love to hear more about your experiences with this phenomena.
So I live in Minneapolis, and we're a pretty old city, and we're growing very rapidly. Lots of people are moving to the city. And it turns out that zoning rules, which are the most dry, boring possible regulation, are one of the big barriers to making sure we have enough homes for everybody who's coming to our city. And what that means is that people who already have a home, people who have a stable place to live, especially access to good schools, they are supporting this single-family zoning. That means we don't have enough space to build more homes. And as people come, the secondary effect is other people are being pushed out. So in Minneapolis, the city was redoing this big plan that we do every 10 years with a 20-year vision called Minneapolis 2040. And one of the things that we did was say, hey, we need to make sure that there are enough homes for everyone. And to do that, we want to end single-family zoning and allow initially we said 4 plexes. In the end, we got 3 plexes everywhere. And that means that more people have access to clean air and safe neighborhoods and good schools. That means that fewer people are being pushed out of their neighborhoods. That means that my former roommate, Renee, when he got married, he and his new wife had to move multiple neighborhoods away because they couldn't find a place in the neighborhood they could afford. When they wanted to buy their first home, they had to move 2 suburbs away. That means Renee and Lily can stay in Minneapolis if that's what they want to do. So I'm excited because a huge grassroots effort, together with the partnership of some folks on the city council and on city staff, we were able to change this despite huge, massive pushback and lots of fear-mongering around bulldozing homes. It's not going to happen. So I'm excited because we're on our way to welcoming lots of people into our city and making space for everyone and making sure everybody who's there already can stay.
So, yeah, that's a great kickoff. One of the things I want to make sure we come back to, if you can just be ready when we get through this first pass, is to hear you talk a little bit about the genesis of those policies, where they came from, and the entrenched interests that fought to maintain those. So we'll be back to that. Mark.
I think my story is a little bit different probably than people were. I was kind of brought up as a Republican in a very Republican household where I kind of believed a lot of what I was told. And I ended up, my dad started a small trophy business in Pennsylvania, and it was pretty successful. But this whole idea of a bigger trophy company getting taxpayer dollars to basically put him out of business was tough for me to swallow, because we always were taught, like, oh, Republicans, we want business in, it's great, we want to be a good place for business to come. And I ran a mayoral campaign in Reading where I said the whole reason we did it was like, oh, we want to bring business in the city, let's give them tax credits, let's make them pay less taxes. And to me, that's like, oh, that makes sense, we want to bring businesses. But when I actually looked at this and who it's hurting, it didn't make any sense to me. And I said, well, like, this is not what we're supposed to believe in. We're supposed to believe in competition where the best person wins and that everyone has a real chance. And that's not what this was. And we basically from that moment on, I kind of shed the label of Republican, kind of looked at each issue by what it is. And the corporate welfare issue is the one that's most near and dear to my heart, because it's the most anti-competitive issue you can possibly think of, where taxpayers invest in something, and invest is a weird word because nobody actually chooses whether they want to or not, but they invest in these gigantic companies run by billionaires, and it's hurting all the small business owners that are competing. We did a documentary in Memphis where IKEA came in. We gave IKEA $15 million to come into the city of Memphis. While at the same time, somebody who had owned a furniture store in the city for 25 years did not get a dime and was eventually put out of business by this place. So look, we want free markets and we want to give everyone a chance to compete. But when we give the big guys a leg up over their smaller competitors and we make people pay taxes in order to put themselves out of business, that just has never made sense to me. So that's kind of where I got into the idea of anti-competitive and stopped looking at the party, Democrat or Republican, and said, let's look at the issue and let's look at what's right. And that's kind of where my genesis to that issue came in.
Hi, my name is Debras Williams. I am a natural hairstylist / braider. I started my business in 1995. I was the first to ever open a salon in the state of Tennessee in a school. I was on public assistance. I had 3 children, and I wanted better for my life. So as I began to create these unique styles, it brought in a lot of revenue. So I launched out. I saved my money. I opened a business. I got a tax ID number. And I went to work, only to be shut down by the government, saying that I was an unlicensed braider. I was breaking the law. And not only for myself did I create wealth, but I created it for other people. I trained them my own technique, and I put them to work. I had an area that they would come in the salon, and I would train them my technique, and they would work and earn a living. And so I fought the state of Tennessee for almost 20 years, trying to get natural hair to have an industry of its own. But what they did, they took it and put it in cosmetology, shut us down, and learned all about natural hair. And then they start creating new laws to keep us from earning a living. It's almost like they were shutting us out. They wanted to take control of the industry. And so I gave up. A friend of mine's had the law passed in the state of Mississippi. And so I moved to Mississippi. And that's where I resided, but I could not operate the school anymore. My family is still in Memphis, and I wanted to be able to pass it on, but I wasn't able to do that. But the Beacon Center stepped in for me. We had the shampoo license abolished. And so now we're working on the braiding license, and hopefully it will pass. And that way I can use my own curriculum, which I've written my own book for my curriculum that I've been training over 25 years. And so I'm hoping that the situation changes in the state of Tennessee for braiders here. And it's not only in Tennessee, it's happening all over the country, where some of the braiders have even been arrested. And as I say, I've been fighting it for over 20 years. So I'm hoping that it passed.
Deborah, if I can just follow up with a question on that. So you mentioned that there was many folks that you were teaching. Was this an opportunity for them to build a career for themselves and a way out of a difficult circumstance to support their families that was shut off by the fact that the state shut your school down?
Oh, yeah. Most of the people were those that were even working on minimum wage jobs. They quit their job and start braiding. That's just how much revenue that they were gaining. And yes, it helps. It built the family. I bought a new home. I was able to purchase my home. I was able to keep my salon open. But mind you, some of the people that came did not have much income, so I came up with a system. And the system were that they didn't pay booth rent like they do everywhere else because they could not afford it. So what we did was allow the people that were coming in to actually make a deposit for their hair. And then when they come in and get their hair done, the rest of the money goes to the person. So the clients really supported it. And the only reason they supported it because the skills that we had, the skills that we were able to offer, we built this industry out of our own pockets. We couldn't get a loan, and there was nothing existing for us, in other words. So we had to build it from the ground up, and everything that was done, it was off of our finances that we gained. So we were able to stay in business that way until the government said that, okay, you're breaking the law. You don't have a license, but there were no license to get. So it was almost like a new business, a new industry on board, and they just took control.
So we'll come back a little bit more to the specific licensing issue. Wonderful story. Thanks for sharing that.
Thanks, John, and it's so good to be here with everyone on the panel and everyone here in the room. So my experience is in the law. I had practiced law for 25 years before filing a brief in the Citizens United case that struck down our election finance and anti-corruption laws and a series of additional cases beyond that, and started American Promise with my friend and board chair, John Wass, who comes out of the business world and is an entrepreneur, has built several companies. And we are working on a constitutional amendment. Many of our members are here at this conference, and we have Americans in every state across partisan lines working to overturn those decisions so that we can actually have reform that is sustainable to keep money out of elections and politics in concentrated ways because concentrated money in politics means concentrated power, and concentrated power favors the kinds of things we're hearing about, where you become a pay-to-play kind of culture instead of a competitive free enterprise and a free, effective republic. It's not a coincidence that free enterprise and democracy emerged together, and it's not a coincidence that oligarchy, whether in Russia or the Middle East, or increasingly here in the United States, leads not only to to a lack of liberty and bad democracy, but to bad free enterprise systems and lack of competition. We have in the room, and if a boy would just hold up her hand, why pay-to-play politics is a losing proposition for business and society. It's a little quick fact sheet. Please pick it up. And so my story of how this all came to be, I've represented big corporations. I've represented pharma corporations as a partner at a large Boston law firm. So attorney-client privilege prevents me from giving you the specifics, but I'll tell you, raising barriers to entry for competitors is part of the plan. And it's acceptable. As Milton Friedman said, it's about maximizing profit. But here's the key thing that we sometimes forget. Milton Friedman also said, within the rules of the game. Within the rules of the game. Now, who sets those rules? The people in a healthy democracy set the rules for effective, competitive marketplaces and good democracy. And then it's go for it. But once those rules start breaking down, because there's an economic incentive to break them down and raise barriers to entry, we end up getting the increasing situation of a lack of divide, essentially, between the economic activity that tends towards concentration and the political realm where we want to break up concentrated power. So I've also served, as John kindly mentioned, in the Attorney General's office, prosecuting antitrust cases, unfair and deceptive trade practices laws, and as an investor through Whaleback Partners, investing in small business people trying to start farms or food companies, particularly in New England. So just a couple of quick examples from those experiences, because I think the lesson for me is there's not good regulation or bad regulation in the abstract. Regulation could be good or bad. It can help serve a competitive marketplace, or it can, hurt a competitive marketplace. And ideally, you have enough rules of the game to make effective competitive markets and free societies that allow everybody to thrive and grow and express themselves and feed their families. But we don't have the ideal, and corruption and pay-to-play politics tends to lead to bad regulations. And if I could just give one example of a good and one example of a bad, or I can come back to it if you want. Yeah, great.
Come back to
Thanks.
examples. So if hold that thought, yeah, because that's something we definitely want to dig into a little more detail. So I'd like to get back to discussing in these scenarios where these policies originate from. What is it? What is the engine that begins to start these policies off track? Jan, I know you have some interesting stories from a housing perspective you could share with us.
Well, so I want to thank you for setting me up perfectly, because barriers to entry is what single-family zoning was created to do. So we have to go back more than 100 years, and we were building a lot of our cities across the United States. And one of the things that was happening is it was at the end of Reconstruction. Has anybody here read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein? Okay, so if you care about race and equity and access to housing, you should check out this book, because it gives an extensive federal history and local history about why our neighborhoods look the way that they do and how we used regulation in order to create an unfair playing field in our communities. So single-family zoning was designed about a century ago specifically to segregate neighborhoods. Right? It is created specifically to create and preserve racially segregated neighborhoods because it makes homes expensive. When you can share the cost of land for multiple homes, it's more affordable to live there. Right? When you can take small spaces and add more folks, when you can have additional apartments inside your house and rent out rooms. These are all things that our zoning code has made illegal. You cannot, in most places in our country today, build a mother-in-law apartment upstairs or in the back of your house or in your backyard if your mother needs a place to live and can't live on her own anymore, because zoning was created explicitly to force housing to be expensive. And that was explicitly about creating racially segregated communities. So it doesn't talk about race, right? Because zoning was created after the Supreme Court said you can't use race in your zoning codes. And so instead we came up with single family parking requirements, bedroom sizes, unit sizes, all sorts of other things to drive things in that direction. Today, it continues to be a barrier to access to the great things in many of our communities. And so single family zoning is strongest in the wealthiest, whitest neighborhoods that have the best schools. Because again, increasing the cost of homes makes those nice neighborhoods exclusive, and only the people who can afford to buy their way in can access those communities. So part of what we faced in Minneapolis here a couple of years ago as we were advocating for change is that there were some folks who created these, I mentioned, scary red bulldozery signs that said they're gonna come and bulldoze your home. We, with Neighbors for More Neighbors, organized some volunteers, and Ryan Johnson's the guy who did this, to bike every single block in the city of Minneapolis and make a map of where are these signs? Who thinks that this is gonna happen? And then he made a map that compared where are those red, scary, this is a terrifying thing signs against property values. And it's probably no surprise that it was the wealthiest neighborhoods that had those red signs, because they want to preserve access to the amazing park system that we have. They want to have barriers to the really high quality public schools, because the really good public schools are in those same neighborhoods, to the clean air, to all those other, the transit amenities that are in those communities. So I think it's really critical that we learn about this history that has been very intentionally hidden, because it's really uncomfortable, right? We don't like to remember that we created great neighborhoods and not so great neighborhoods on purpose because of our own bigotry, right? That's painful for me as a person who's white to remember that and wrestle with that. So that's part of, for me, why it's really important that I stood up and called on my neighbors, 'cause I'm in one of those neighborhoods with a lot of red signs, and say, hey, I want to change this, right? I want to reduce those barriers to entry and make sure everybody has access to all of our awesome communities. I want to make sure that people can do with their property what they want to do. And if that means building a small apartment inside their home or a mother-in-law apartment in their backyard, that they can.
From my perspective, I think when we're talking about tax incentive for corporate welfare, there's two small things that I think happen is the incentive structure of all these. It's what that looks like. So when you have an incentive for the government and a big business to come together and say, okay, look, we're going to give you $10 million of tax dollars for this thing, and in turn, you'll give us $5 million for our campaign donation or whatever. I mean, that's a win-win contribution, right? So, I mean, if that's it, if you're a big business or a politician, that's a great deal. You both win. The issue is that the taxpayers are the ones losing. And they have done such a good job of making this politically popular. It's like, oh, look, here's a ribbon cutting. Check out this new thing with 40 jobs from completely out of states. I mean, it's $2 million a job, but don't worry about that. But they do this thing, and they've done such a great job of acting like the taxpayers are getting a benefit from it. And in reality, that's not the case. So the incentive structure right now is for them to do this. And until people are willing to stand up and say, you know what, let's just not take the PR, the press release that they send out and say, oh, this is great. But it really isn't when you look at it. So I think that once the incentive structure changed, where businesses and politicians could both win, of course they're going to do that. And it's up to us to stand up. And then I think the second thing, which is general, is I think that capitalism in some ways it's gone from a completely capitalist society to a place where we put all these things to keep people out. And in my opinion, the corruption is a glitch of capitalism, right? It's a feature of socialism, in my opinion. And I think when you're looking at this, you're putting a lot of these regulations in where it just helps a certain high class of people. And in my opinion, that's socialism, right? It's doing socialist type policies and making sure that only the rich can win while everyone else is left there. So I think it's a combination of those things that have led to where we're at now, at least in corporate welfare.
So, Deborah, you had mentioned earlier that the cosmetology board was the source of some of the restrictions, or at least lobbied for those restrictions that would keep you out of business. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned your efforts, I guess solo efforts to some degree, for many years to try to fight against a very well-organized and probably well-financed cosmetology lobby. Can you talk a little bit about your efforts and then how that changed when you had some organizations that had some resources to put behind you to help?
Yeah. I had a bill introduced by, he was senator at the time, Coins, and he introduced the bill, but it did not pass in the House, which Louis DeBerry did not allow the bill to go through. And so they gave the cosmetology board time to take control of the industry. My fight had been so long because I didn't know anyone that could help me. After Harford Sr. took the article to the Institute of Justice, they contacted me and they put me in touch with Mr. Taladin Akhtar, who had a company called Cornrow and Company. Him and his wife fought 10 years in Washington, D.C. and won. So they were helping other braiders around the country. So when I was introduced to him, he came into Tennessee to try and help. But even in that, they just took control and they refused to allow braiders to keep their industries and keep their businesses. It was really, they looked at, first of all, the finance, the money, how much money we were making, but they were not looking at the fact that we created the industry, that we had put everything we had into it. Because braiding did not exist, neither did salons exist. No schools were there, there was nothing. So if you learned to braid, you would have to learn from another individual or, a family member. But what I did, I took it farther and I began to open up the salon. They saw the finances of it, and that's where the control comes in. And they still stand on that today. We're still fighting. There are other states, I think about 28 states that have been exempt. But Tennessee was one of the toughest one. Texas was one of the toughest one. And ISIS, she finally got it passed in Texas. And so between her and myself, we'll be the longest running trying to get this bill passed because they refuse to let it go. I think that the cosmetology board, to ask a braider to go to school for something that they already know, it doesn't make sense. And you're asking me to go to your school and learn where I know that my expertise is much greater. And so, but it's not, they don't care whether you really know how to braid hair or not. They just want you to pay for the license.
How much time, how many hours, and how many dollars would it have cost you if you had attempted to go through that process to get a license that would have allowed you to braid hair?
And Louis DeBerry put 300 hours. And then I think it's about $1,500 now.
And how many of 300 hours would have been involved with braiding hair?
None.
Yeah.
Just sanitation. And I think that you can go to the health department and learn sanitation. And like I was saying to them before, my argument was everybody in this room has some form of sanitation. You get up in the morning, you wash your face, you brush your teeth, you do your hygiene, you do everything that's necessary. That's, you're keeping yourself clean. That's not hard to do. And so they labeled us as not knowing how to sanitize, and that's crazy because I wouldn't want to put my hand in anybody's hair that has not been shampooed. Yeah. So we were not even doing any cosmetology work at all. They go to their regular cosmetologist, they get their hair shampooed. It has to be ready before they come because braiding takes up to 22 hours, basically. You don't have time to do all of the shampooing and the cutting, as they say. You just don't have time for it, so. And they didn't understand braiding, so, and not that they wanted to, they just wanted to take control of it.
Wonderful. Jeff, maybe now we can come back to some examples that you might.
Well, some different examples, because we're hearing examples, but I said there's good regulation and bad regulation, and a corrupt system tends to lead to bad regulation, i.e. it doesn't serve the public interest, and it helps those who pay for the political system to deliver those. But I want to, maybe it's unpopular up here, but I want to say a word about good regulation. We need regulation if we don't want our planes to fall out of the sky. We're now experiencing what it's like when you have concentrated power, essentially one airline that owns the FTA and FAA in a lot of ways, and supposedly self-regulated and decided it was okay to have a one failure system where one thing goes wrong, this plane goes to the ground. And that's what we have now. A little smaller version of that, there's a bacteria in ice cream that kills people if it's not sanitized. It kills people. Listeria, 200 die a year, thousands are ill. And I had a case as a young lawyer where our local regulation in a relatively large, but still a family dairy in a town near us in Boston, decided that was kind of a pesky rule. And it was self-regulation, essentially. They were doing their own testing, like any good business would, because no good business wants to sell contaminated ice cream to anybody. So the rule was do your own testing, but turn in the results to the local Department of Public Health. So it's not a big bureaucracy. Just drop them off at the local Department of Health so they can be on top of it too if anyone gets sick. And they decided when they get bad results to make them good results, basically forged the results and turned them in. So that was a case I prosecuted. And I want to emphasize that because it's an example of a good regulation because they were punished and had to clean up their act. But that not only protects people in the public who otherwise can't test their own ice cream before eating it, right? It protects businesses because there are lots of honest businesses trying to compete. And the reason we call them unfair and deceptive trade practices isn't only that it's unfair and deceptive to the public, it's unfair and deceptive competition. And you want healthy competition within the rules of the road. The other examples, and I know everyone could say, look at the Wall Street subsidies and look at the pharma companies, that you can invest in this political system as concentrated business and get a lot out of it. And we all know that happens every day. But when I was a young lawyer, the wall had just come down, and the Berlin Wall. There was a whole bunch of new countries that didn't have free enterprise and they didn't have democracy, and we as a country really wanted them to have both because it's very hard to have one without the other. And the ABA, the American Bar Association, had a program to get lawyers to help Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics get up off the ground and work hopefully towards democracy. And the reason the lawyers were called to action and what we were trying to do was get a rule of law. It wasn't like, oh great, we now have a huge continent-wide place with no regulation. Let's see what happens. The first thing we realized was we have to get a rule of law. You need contracts enforced. You need fair competition. And so we lawyers and the Bar Association tried our best. We all know that has not in the end worked out so well, and it isn't rule of law, and we have oligarchy, concentrated power, pay-to-play culture, billionaires who are connected to the government, and I think that's what we want to avoid. So we want good regulation, and to get it, we need good campaign finance and election and anti-corruption laws, and then we'll have less bad regulation, more opportunity for citizens to start their own good businesses and compete, and better democracy and outcomes for everybody.
That's great. So it's fascinating to think about ways in which these anti-competitive efforts by these special interests can be overcome. So Deborah, yours was a great story about you individually trying to challenge it and then eventually getting some help from some outside groups that could marshal some resources to your side. Jan, I'm interested in a little bit more about the story in Minneapolis. Where did the energy to confront such a significant challenge come from, and who and how were the resources to do that marshaled?
So in Minneapolis, we have a very active organizing culture. So that's a foundation that we have to begin with. And there are a lot of things that are happening in Minneapolis that helped get us going on this pathway. So there is a blog called streets.mn where more than 100 volunteers write blog posts about all sorts of things around how we build our streets and our communities and buildings and why and what it means for different people in the community, right? So that's a place for conversation. We have a really great policy school, and a lot of the folks there like it in Minneapolis and stick around, and so they're very active in the community. And we also have a very active democracy. We had, I think, the highest turnout of any major city in the United States in the midterms a couple of months ago. That's not unusual. It was extra high this time, but we always have good high voter turnout and very active local elections. So all of those things laid the foundation because we were talking about the challenges we as a city face when it comes to having space for everybody, when it comes to having the worst in the nation racial disparities, when it comes to struggling around climate change and good transportation and good schools. That was familiar in our conversation. And then our city government was working on those. And so that meant that the elected leaders had said to the staff at the city, we want you to come up with a proposal for how, when we do our next big 10-year-long plan, we're going to make sure it works for the people of Minneapolis, right? So they were given permission by elected leaders. And then when the staff went out to the community and said, hey, let us know what you think. What kind of city do you want to live in 20 years from now? First, how old are you going to be in 2040, right? Okay, when you're that age, when your kids are that age, when your kids have kids in 2040, what kind of a city do you want them to live in? And then we had lots of engagement. So the combination of this really rich conversation, lots of people being active, supportive elected officials, and then staff who were really asking people what they wanted, that meant that groups like Neighbors for More Neighbors, and we weren't alone. MN 350 was there, and Our Streets Minneapolis, and a whole bunch of other groups were also doing this work. We could reach out to volunteers and say, hey, if you have an opinion, here is a chance to show up and say what it is that you want. And we organized walk-in talks with elected officials to walk around and say, here's what's in my neighborhood that I love that has been made illegal since it was built. We have lots of fourplexes all over the city. They're not legal anymore. If they burned down or got knocked down, they couldn't get rebuilt, and people love those buildings. Those sorts of conversations happened. And so over the course of a year, some of the city council members who were really iffy up front, between their peers working with them, staff working with them, and their constituents working with them, that meant that at the end we had a better plan than we started out with because there were some real gaps in the beginning, and that we could pass it. And in the end, it was passed 12-1. And it was interesting to me how it passed 12-1 because that's not where we started when we first saw the draft. It was very iffy when we first saw the draft. But that 12-1, 12 of the council members represent almost the entire city. And the one is from that part of the city with all those red signs, right? I think that open engagement process gave city council members the opportunity to see a really different story than they usually see. I don't know if anybody here has ever been to a neighborhood meeting or a planning commission meeting or a public hearing about building a new building in your community. But if you go to those, you'll see a few very passionate and kind of nervous, scared people who are really afraid of what might happen down their block. You don't see that. Mostly people are like, well, heck yeah, I want to have that apartment building up the block. Or heck yeah, I want to have safe places for people to bike and walk to school. Or heck yeah, that would be a great business. And so this opportunity let people in City Hall see that there's actually very broad support for big, ambitious changes to make our city a place that works for every single person in it, not just the voices that are really nervous about what that change might mean for them personally.
It's a wonderful story and well articulated. Thank you. Mark, any thing you can share with us about examples of success where state or local governments stopped using these incentives? Obviously, there's competition among states and localities and cities to use them. Any examples of progress?
Well, I mean, I think that it's a great point what was made earlier, too. I mean, we do need regulation. I wasn't trying to claim no regulations, but I mean, it should be just health and safety. And when we go up to looking at what incentives done, I mean, the best examples are places like Florida, which have gotten rid of specific ones, where they got rid of the film incentives because it just, even government studies, which are always rigged, in my opinion, showed they were losing money. So if the government's showing
film incentives, you said?
Yes, film incentives, yes. And if the government's showing that you're losing money, you are losing a lot of money. So I think when you look at what Florida did, that's a great example. Even the state of California, which is, I mean, Hollywood, they're going to lessen their film incentives because they're just not getting good return on investment on it. And that's the issue with this generally, is that we hear from the people up top that, oh, we're only attracting these businesses because we're giving them money. It's not true. They need to go somewhere. There's so many other things. There's a workforce. There's what your tax structure looks like, what your politicians are, your inclusivity policy. There's so many other reasons people go places. But again, the incentives are, well, we're not going to get money, so we need to convince the public that it's great for everyone when it's not. But I think Florida and California, which I can't believe I'm using California as an example of good policy, but Florida and California are good places to look, where they're starting to roll back some of these incentive programs. And the Los Angeles Rams is the last thing I'm going to say, that they got a stadium, they moved their stadium, they didn't get $1 of tax dollars, which is incredible. While we're getting a stupid soccer stadium that nobody wants for $25 million here, but that's fine.
All right. We have a couple of questions. I have some wrap-up questions if we have time, but let's go to some questions from the audience. So the first one, Yana, for you. Gentrification is a problem in many places, but how do we balance that with healthy growth?
So I'm not sure what healthy growth means. Gentrification is a real problem. People are being pushed out of our cities, and, across the entire country, and especially in core cities, our populations are growing, right? And we need to make sure that people can stay in their communities, and we have no way of stopping new people from coming. So that's a real tension. Now, I want to be really clear that ending single-family zoning, which is what we did or are doing in Minneapolis, that is not going to make sure everybody has a stable, affordable place to live, right? And what Neighbors for Neighbors really stands up for is making sure everybody can choose what neighborhood they live in and have a stable place. We're going to have to do more than that. So we are going to have to invest more in affordable housing and in supporting people who can't pay what homes cost, because they are expensive. And no matter how much support we have for folks who just aren't earning enough money to pay for what a house costs, if we don't make it legal to build enough homes, there is nothing we can do to make sure that people have places to live. Because if you've got 200,000 families and 100,000 homes, they don't all fit, right? And you can't build social housing if that's your personal passion, if it's illegal to build any housing, because social housing is a home. So we need to wrestle with this, and it's going to be awkward and hard, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. We're really struggling with the dramatic growth that we have in Minneapolis, and it's really dramatic when something changes across the street from you, but I know we can't end gentrification and displacement if we don't ensure that the people who are limiting access to the cities, which are the people who are in the wealthiest, whitest neighborhoods, are doing their fair share to make space as our cities grow. Because right now what's happening in Minneapolis and almost every city across the country that's struggling with this issue is those wealthy neighborhoods that are benefiting from this really scarce resource of a great neighborhood, great schools, access to parks, all those things people want to be near. The more they limit that, the more they're pushing all the new folks into the neighborhoods where we've allowed more housing to be built, which are historically redline neighborhoods, neighborhoods that are disproportionately people of color. We need to let those neighborhoods have control over their destiny, and my neighborhood needs to do its share.
Very good. So Mark, you're in Nashville here, kind of ground zero for some of the Amazon debates going on. Amazon had a pretty bruising battle up in New York, and eventually pulled out of their effort there. What are your thoughts on Amazon coming to town? And is there a risk of them getting some kind of unfair corporate advantage here in Nashville?
Well, let me say one thing I never thought I'd say. Thank God for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because she was 100% right on that. I never thought I'd say anything positive about her, but she was great on that. But look, Amazon got $102 million. And what's even worse is, especially talking about the issues we have with housing and kind of poor communities not getting money, is that we can't balance a budget in Nashville. We were $15 million under our budget. Guess what? We gave Amazon $15 million in cash. It wasn't a tax break. We give them $15 million of cash that we don't have. So how's anybody who's fiscally responsible to say, oh, our firefighters, police, teachers aren't getting paid what they're supposed to? But let's give $15 million to Amazon because Jeff Bezos doesn't have enough money as it is. We need to make sure we pad his pockets. So I do think that Amazon's a perfect example of people seeing a company that clearly doesn't need the money, who is taking advantage of the system for their gain. Now, can we blame them? I don't blame them. I mean, every business is going to try to make as much money as they can. We have to blame the government officials who allow that to happen. They're the ones who we elect. They're the ones who give out our money. So look, I don't think Amazon should have done that. And if I was a business owner, I wouldn't want to do that because it's terrible in my opinion. But we have to look at the problem here. It's not the corporations. It's the government and the entrenched interests who are willing to give them money. And it's the rules of the system that we talked about that is the problem with that.
Very good. Okay, Jeff. How can regulators be held accountable, especially unelected regulators?
Well, in the best way, they're held accountable by we, the people, of course. In the nearer term, before the next election, because we don't elect regulators, we elect representatives. We need to make sure that our representatives are doing their job. And that means oversight. That means actually changing the laws that aren't working. It means getting rid of bureaucracies if they're not doing their job. And it means adding regulation and enforcement when that's necessary. But the only way to get that right is to make sure they're representing the people. Because I think generally speaking, the people will get, even if we disagree, as we just heard from someone who clearly is not a socialist saying, hey, the socialists got something right here, you know? So, and I agree completely with Mark on corporate welfare. It's the American people are paying, I'm sure it's in the T with trillions. I mean, we have $22 trillion in national debt right now, and it's going up rapidly because of this subsidy extraction thing. And that's not the bureaucrats or regulators. That is the pay-to-play culture. So I think often the regulators are actually intimidated and threatened by the political bosses. And the FAA regulators have said that. There's a memo at the Federal Aviation Authority documenting those concerned about safety and the coziness of the political appointees, as you said, the politicians, the political appointees with Boeing because of the pay-to-play culture. So regulators can be held accountable by good oversight by elected officials and by changing and good appointees. But if the system is contaminated with corruption, with runaway money, if we don't get back to separating the government from the corporate and union and economic sphere, it's going to be very hard because the accountability then isn't going to be whether they're doing a good job or not. It's going to be whether they're actually working for us or whether they're working for the companies who are paying so much to get the corrupted system extended. So,
very good.
I think we got to fix. I think we have a systemic problem, not a one regulator problem. And can I just say one more thing about antitrust laws? Because I think two things have happened in my career in the past 3 decades. One is the Constitution was changed without the people's input or being asked by the Supreme Court, which struck down all our campaign finance laws. The other thing that happened without our real involvement was the antitrust laws were radically changed by sort of theory. It used to be that we were worried about concentrated bigness, so we broke up Ma Bell. You know, we broke up Standard Oil, not because of anything particularly they did wrong, except get so big that they were beyond the capacity of the people to have accountability for them, and they were damaging marketplaces. Antitrust law was changed so that bigness didn't matter, and we now have global scale companies that can drive power into our system with money or otherwise, and Amazon is one of them. And until we get the Constitution fixed and antitrust laws that can actually be enforced as they were intended to be, with not just efficiency isn't everything, but democracy and competitive marketplaces are what matter, then I think, again, these are system solutions. It's not like, oh, there's one regulator over here is a problem or one law over here. We need this sort of DNA of our economic and political worlds fixed, and that's the Constitution and sort of big structural things like antitrust laws.
Very good. Deborah, how likely is it that the restrictions for hair braiding in Tennessee are overturned? And if they are, will you move back to Nashville and open up your school?
I'll move back to Memphis and open up my school and train. I love what I do. I have a passion for it, and I like, helping people. I like to see people grow and thrive, and that's what we had. We had a thriving business that we created, by the bootstraps. I just think that the government, people that we have elected to be in our corner to make sure that people are thriving economically in their lives, and and you take that away because you want what you see, and it doesn't belong to you. It's unfair, it's unjust, but I was strong. I kept up the fight until I just couldn't do it by myself. But then help came. The Institute of Justice and the Beacon Center stepped right in. And I think this time we're going to make it, And I don't have a weary spirit. I'm not giving up. I'm really thankful for the Beacon Center because there are laws that are being made and, underhand, So I'm appreciative of it.
You guys can see why I said earlier on that Debra's a hero for all that she's done. Thank you. Jan, in Minneapolis, are there policies in place for affordable housing? Nashville is currently a hot city with many new citizens, which has caused gentrification and pushed many into their surrounding counties. So similar question, I think. Anything in particular to discuss with regard to other affordable housing policies in Minneapolis?
So we love our affordable housing policies in Minneapolis, and we've got a bunch. So part of why I chose to focus on this issue is that this is where there was a gap. So we invest money in building affordable housing every year. We have an affordable housing trust fund, and that's an important funding source. And we would need, we currently invest typically $10 million a year. We would need billions of dollars a year to make sure everybody could afford a home. So we need to find other solutions too. Something that I think was incredibly smart is that our city council president, Lisa Bender, who is a big affordable housing champion, she insisted that when we passed this comprehensive plan that requires us to change our zoning, that we also pass an inclusionary zoning ordinance. And so I'm using lots of jargony words, right? So the zoning is about what can you build where. Inclusionary housing means when you're building something new that's above a certain size, so it wouldn't apply to a fourplex, but it would apply to something with 20 or more apartments in it, a certain portion of those apartments have to be affordable, and that gets funded by the folks who are building that. And the city is helping make that more affordable by letting you build a little bit more so that can help cover the cost of doing some affordable housing. And then we're investing heavily in tenants' rights. So we know that evictions fall unfairly, especially on people of color in our city, and that evictions lead directly to homelessness. Evictions lead to challenges in school. Evictions lead to health problems. And so we're also investing in lawyers to make sure that tenants who are facing the threat of eviction, which may well be unfair, have representation in courts. And then lastly, we're looking at a real tenants' bill of rights that will make sure people have rights when they're going up against their landlords in terms of evictions, and a whole host of other pieces too, what you can expect. So we're looking at a whole suite of things. This piece about having enough homes is one part of it. You need all the different pieces if we're going to succeed in making sure people can stay in their communities and new people have places when they show up to you.
All right, last question before we get to our wrap up. Many of these issues kind of defy traditional party labels, and we've talked a little bit about that across the political spectrum. Debra, your story is a great one. It's hard to imagine any moral person not wanting to fight for you and your right to earn a living and support your family. What advice do you guys have for how to appeal across the spectrum in a politically charged environment that we're in today to get groups of folks together who might not agree on every issue, but can agree on some of these issues with regards to anti-competitive behavior? How can you marshal folks that otherwise wouldn't agree with you to help to push back against some of these?
Can I jump in on that? Because it's one of the biggest challenges we have at American Promise and have had a lot of success. So I could share some of our success. First, as I said, we're working on a constitutional amendment. That's a big, big lift. We have 27 amendments. This will be 28. The way amendments happen is you need 3/4 of the states to ratify it after it comes out of 2/3 of Congress. So if you just think about that for a second, there's no way to do it without getting Americans to agree on this principle of the amendment, which is that we, the people, have a right to protect our equal rights to be represented and to speak and participate in our elections, to pass election funding and anti-corruption laws that limit the influence of money in our elections, and to separate corporations and unions from that process so they can be in the economic sphere doing what they do and not in the political game. And that we have seen is attractive to Americans everywhere. We're over 80% support. We have former Republicans like Olympia Snowe and Al Simpson on our advisory council, with Democrats like Nina Turner and Mike Dukakis. We have faith leaders, business leaders, veterans, and Americans are coming together. And I think that the secret is transparent and authentic focus on the goal that we all share, which is this country succeeding as a democracy and a republic of the people, and sticking to it and not getting pulled into different things. And then second, empowering the people to do what they can do where they live without sort of top down saying it's got to be this way. And so one of the most exciting things we've just launched, in addition to all our grassroots work, is Business for American Promise, to give business people a chance to come in, to have their voice heard, to say, we don't like this system either. We don't want to be paying to get subsidies, but if we don't do it, our competitor will. We don't want to be buying politicians, and most small businesses can't, but even the big ones are saying it often feels like extortion to us, not bribery. We're getting the calls and saying, we're sure you're going to be at the fundraiser next week because your competitor is. And the message is clear. So I think if we empower people, regardless of their political beliefs or their party registration, to join in this great national effort and be disciplined about it, Americans want to fix this system. And we have to focus on creating the pathways for us to do it together. Even, that's why we say cross-partisan, not non-partisan. It's okay to have radically different views on the politics of things and argue and fight about them, but come together as Americans to do the big things that we have to do together to fix the system.
Yep. And just to add on to what he said, I think it's important, is let's stop insulting people on the other side because we don't agree with them, right? Because look, if I disagree with you 90% of the time, I can still work with you on 10% of things. But if you call somebody I guess I can't use that language in here, but if you insult people all the time and you question their motives, I mean, the thing is that we mostly all agree on the problems. We might have different solutions, and we should have discussions, and they should be hard discussions, but we don't need to insult the people. We don't need to insult every Democrat, every Republican, because we don't like where they stand on an issue. So I think that's more the civil discourse thing. It's like, look, you're going to disagree, and we should have discussions about that, but you're not going to get anything done if, when you agree, you still hate that person. I mean, Trump did some criminal justice reform, and I saw people in life like, nope, nothing he does can possibly be right, so we're not going to get behind that, right? Or Barack Obama doing stuff on occupational licensing, and people on the right are like, oh, nope, can't deal with Barack Obama doing anything. So let's look at the person and assume that we don't question their motives, because that's a big thing. And if we do that, I think it'll be a lot easier to come up with bipartisan solutions when we all agree on something like we do on this stage tonight.
So our challenge was a little bit different than exactly that one. Minneapolis is a liberal progressive city. And what we really needed to do was engage people who don't usually pay attention to local issues. And that's often younger folks, it's renters. People of color vote at much lower rates in Minneapolis compared to white homeowners, right? So we ended up relying on two key things. One is transparency. So a lot of these conversations around homes and do we have enough and zoning policy and what's happening in your city are in teeny tiny meetings that almost nobody goes to. And so we ended up having volunteers who would go to those meetings and live tweet them. And people would be like, that's what's happening in those meetings. And then they would start to pay attention and care. The other thing was humor, that it turns out that if you can show and make this kind of super nerdy thing fun and funny, that people care and start paying attention. And so we have people who tune into Wedge Live, which is the preeminent hyper-local news source in the Twin Cities. He's the guy who goes to a lot of these meetings. He's hilarious. And so they tune in when he goes to a local planning commission meeting because they're going to see one hilarious 22-second video of somebody saying something so ridiculous and over the top that you had no idea anybody would dare to say it in public. So for us, we've really engaged a lot of young people and a lot of people who don't usually pay attention locally by letting people know what's happening in these tiny rooms that have open doors, but who wants to go to all of them, and doing it in a way that is funny and accessible.
Well, that's a wonderful note to close the panel on. Thank you. I want to thank each of you guys, and it's been a pleasure to share the stage with you. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Unrig the System. Tune in next time to learn about a bipartisan push to win the next constitutional amendment targeting corruption.
And be sure to subscribe to keep learning from incredible leaders, activists, and advocates. To find out more about the Unrig Summit, the democracy reform movement, and how you can get involved, go to unrigsummit.com.